I am going to just quickly talk about is me. I work with Amar. He is the owner of EverStrong. So if you guys have any particular questions, if it starts to get a little bit too detailed where I can't just give you a quick answer, I'd be more than happy to have you guys consult us and see if we can help you in any way, shape, or form with your movement. Cool. A little bit about myself. I am the boyfriend of this lovely instructor here. I've heard good things about her from all you guys as well. I have a background as a physical therapist and also a personal trainer. I have my certified strength and conditioning specialist. So in a nutshell, I love helping people move as much as they can. So without further ado, we're going to start by talking about nutrition as it relates to recovery. So as we talk about nutrition, there are two main groups we can talk about. The first is macronutrients and the second is micronutrients. So when I talk about macronutrients, also called macros, we are discussing carbohydrates, fats, or also commonly called lipids, and then our first major macronutrient, protein. So when we think of protein, most of us probably think of like a protein bar or, big old fat steak. But what proteins essentially are structurally as it relates to us is our scaffolding. It's keratin, collagen, myosin, and actin. These are all very specific names for different kinds of proteins that make up the human body. So like I've said, keratin, that's what makes up our skin, our nails. Collagen, it's what makes up our tendons, ligaments, and our skin, whereas this myosin and actin makes up our muscles. So protein, if we break that down, so we can sort of think of it like a Lego Millennium Falcon. That's how I first thought about it, because as a kiddo, that's what I made. I put all these Legos together and I made that big old structure out of them. The Millennium Falcon is the protein. It's the structure, whereas if we break that down into its constituent components, that's what amino acids are. There's two kinds of those Legos building blocks of proteins. There's essential amino acids and then there's non-essential amino acids. And this is where it gets important that we obtain our essential amino acids. 9 of them, you can reference them. They all have very fun names. We need to get those from our food sources. These are not things that we can make ourselves, but rather stuff that we need to get from our foods, whereas the 11 other non-essentials are sort of compounds that we can mix and match and make within our body. Important for recovery, protein quality. So we want to ideally ingest foods that are complete proteins, foods that are animal meats, eggs, dairy, tofu. Essentially, these complete proteins have all of those essential amino acids as well as the non-essential amino acids. So when we exercise, our muscles break down, we need them to recover. It's best suited to get them from complete proteins or incomplete proteins that we use in a complementary form. So specifically talking about complementary proteins in the forms of like grains and legumes, so rice and beans, they might have different essential amino acids, but if you can get 4 essential amino acids from one group of foods, as well as the 5 others of those 9 essentials, put them together, and then essentially you get all of those essential amino acids complemented from those 2 separate food groups so that you can make these structural proteins so that you can recover from your exercise. Yeah, go for it.
Is it true that quinoa has them all?
Pardon?
Is it true that quinoa has all?
Quinoa? I couldn't tell you specifics.
Okay.
What I would,
heard it was like the only grain that did have them all. Maybe that's not true.
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
That's what I know.
Yeah, so going forward, general recommendations for protein. There's an RDI, a recommended daily intake of about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of our body. For us who are more active, or if we do higher amounts of activity specific to resistance training, that's where we can get that recommended daily amount to move up gradually to around 1.6 to 2.2, depending on the intensity, duration, and type of training that we are doing. So again, If we break stuff down, we want to have the Legos to build everything back up once we do. The last thing I will say is there's usually a topic when I discuss this with my clients about like it's called an anabolic window. It just means what time frame can I ingest that protein where it's going to build back these structures that I've broken down through exercise. Generally speaking, the best anabolic window, the window where you consume these proteins and they get built back into what we have broken down, is about 4 to 6 hours, but there's a lot of studies showing that that window can span out about 24 hours. Second thing that I usually get questions on is like whey versus like soy in terms of protein types that we get from the protein bars and then our protein powders. Whey is broken down much quicker.
Did you say 4 to 6 hours after or?
Before or after. So there's a little bit of a window before. So let's say I'm working out at 2 o'clock. I can take that protein drink at about 11, or I can take it at about 7, that sort of 3-ish window either side. That's where that's going to be broken down through our intestines and then bought to those tissues that need to recover. Cool. Sorry, I'm getting a little off my window here. So anabolic window, that's what I was going back after. Whey protein broken down quicker, soy protein broken down a little bit more gradually throughout the day. The last thing I want to discuss is plant proteins, especially for vegetarians and more particularly for vegans. That's where it becomes really important that you get those complementary proteins that build that entire sort of amino acid base so that you're not missing any and you don't have the ability to build back those structures. The other thing I will talk about is negative caloric balance. So let's say we go for a very long run and we do that several times throughout the week. And what starts to happen is we don't ingest enough calories to the point where our body isn't having the energy available to build back these structures. Particularly, what can happen is protein will start to be metabolized as a source of energy, and that can lead to less muscle being built or reduced performance. So, this is what I will say if we are potentially dieting or potentially if we're doing a lot of aerobic or resistive training, our protein, specifically if we're not getting as many calories as we normally do, needs to become a little bit higher so that we can offset that. Or we risk the potential deleterious effect of not being able to have other sources of energy fuel us where protein from muscles gets broken down. So pretty darn important with that. The second form of macronutrients is carbohydrates. So where proteins are a little bit more suited to build structures, the second macronutrient, carbohydrates, is more utilized for energy. There are quite a few different forms of carbohydrates, and they are usually classified by the amount of sugar units that they have. So monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, galactose. I'm sure you've probably all looked at a food label and saw all of those guys before. Glucose is the currency of the body. That is essentially what is broken down from all these different forms of carbohydrates and used as the main fuel source. Disaccharides, meaning 2 sugar units, are sucrose, lactose, and maltose, where sucrose is the 2 units of glucose and fructose. It's table sugar. Lactose, what we get out of milk, that milk sugar is galactose and glucose. And then our final major one is maltose, which is just glucose and glucose. The last kind of major sugar is polysaccharide, which are complex carbohydrates, so multiple chains of those sugar units. Starch is what is broken down from plant carbohydrates. So you get starchy foods like a potato. Those are rich in carbohydrates, so they're broken down into that glucose unit. Glycogen is essentially what is stored in muscles and in the liver. 2/3 in the skeletal muscles and 1/3 in the liver. This is sort of our second energy unit, where if we run out of glucose in the bloodstream, our sort of immediate source of energy, carbohydrates, glycogen from the muscles and the liver, that's what starts to get burned as our fuel source. The last major polysaccharide is fiber. This is really important as it slows down digestion, adds bulk to our stool, essentially allows us to absorb more of the nutrients out of our foods. Recommended daily intake is 38 grams for men, 25 for women. The next thing we'll talk about is glycemic index. So that just essentially is how fast a food is broken down in terms of raising blood glucose, and then also for how long that blood glucose is elevated. So that is very important specifically for diabetics, if there's any diabetics in here, where everyone has probably heard insulin is what takes that blood sugar out of, or the glucose out of the blood and then stores it. So insulin, hormone, just allows that blood sugar, essentially the sugar taken out of the blood and then stored if there is an excess of calories. Glycemic index, there are tons of different websites out there, over 70, whereas 100 is like white bread, indicating a very high glycemic index. Over 70, those foods are going to get broken down quicker. Essentially, blood glucose spikes, and then because of that large spike, insulin then takes that blood glucose and stores it. So higher glycemic index foods, if that energy is not used quickly, that will be stored as fat quicker. Whereas low glycemic index foods like brown rice, bread, those can be broken down slower and then are slowly used as fuel source throughout our day. So generally speaking, high glycemic index foods stored quicker as fat, and they also have a couple of deleterious effects on our general overall health if they are eaten in abundance. Carbohydrate recommendations, RDI, recommended daily intake, is about 130 grams of carbs per day for about 45 to 60% of our total calories. So this is where the bulk of our energy comes from, carbs. I've already talked about how high glycemic index foods, those not as good as low, especially if we are looking at slowly burning that food. And then aerobic athletes, if someone is like a marathon runner, recreational activity kind of runner, carbs would be something that we could utilize after about 60 to 90 minutes of running. As our body starts to burn the glucose within our bloodstream and in the cells, we need to replenish that, and then you can utilize some kind of fuel gel for that. You'll often see endurance athletes using that kind of stuff. I'm going to try and get through this because I'm sensing that nutrition, not exactly the most exciting stuff. So hold with me. Last one is our fats and lipids. This is where we store our energy. So generally speaking, lipids or fats, they hold about 9 calories per gram of energy versus proteins and carbohydrates only holding about 4 grams per calorie. Just means that lipids are a much more abundant source of fuel than proteins or carbohydrates. Sorry, talking here. Does anyone have any questions? Because I do want to make this understandable.
What would be your like top fiber thing that maybe we haven't thought of? Or I feel like fiber is sometimes hard to find. Like it seems like such a huge thing that we're supposed to get in a day.
Yeah, so fruits, apples, bananas, and then one that I often will tell my patients who have breakfast cereals is sprinkle a little bit of bran flake in. Like that's a huge source of fiber, and it should allow your digestion to occur slower, where you're going to get more nutrient out of that food. Cool. Any other questions?
I double checked, and according to Harvard, quinoa has all 9 essential.
Heck yeah. Hit your quinoa if you're trying to get that complete protein. Cool. Jumping back to fats and lipids, fats are incredibly important. I feel like they get ostracized as sort of taboo. I don't want to have a lot of fat in my diet, but fat is essential. If we don't have it, we can't make hormones properly. We are essentially, if we don't have enough of it stored, we aren't insulated. if our body temperature gets too cold or too hot, not many good things are going to happen with that. So it's very important for insulation, brain health, and then generally for satiety and having that feeling of fullness after a meal. In terms of structures, there's saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. I don't want to get lost in the detail with this, but essentially it equates to how much energy is in that kind of fat, whereas saturated have the most, monounsaturated a little bit less, and then polysaturated a little bit less. Generally speaking, saturated fats are more solid at room temperatures, like butter or sort of that animal fat, if you're looking at that big piece of red meat. Whereas polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, they're more oils such as olive oil, peanut oil, canola oil. Generally speaking, saturated fats can be deleterious to your health because they can increase your LDL, your bad cholesterol, whereas monounsaturated and specifically polyunsaturated fats can lower that LDL or bad cholesterol. Cool. Generally speaking, for the general public, fat should account for about 20 to 35% of total calories, whereas there should be no less than about 15% of fat in your diet. That being important because, like I said, hormonal function, brain function, if we don't have that amount, we can't essentially make those structures, those chemicals, and can lead to various deleterious effects in our body. I put this in here. I often get this question from my female patients who are going on diets and trying to lose fat. I want everyone to understand that fat, again, isn't inherently bad, and there's a couple of ways that are structured in terms of BMI and body fat percentage. So BMI essentially just takes your height, subtracts that from your total weight. It can be a good general idea of body mass index or body composition, but it can miss the larger mark, especially for those individuals who have more fat-free mass, muscle. So myself, I'm technically overweight at a BMI of 28, but I'll be blunt, I'm pretty in shape. I can run fairly well, and then I can lift fairly well. So my thought is BMI, it can be a good metric, but there's better forms of body composition to take account of. So particularly if we're taking body fat percentage from like a DEXA scan or a BIA, they're just tools that we can utilize to compare the amount of fat that individual has relative to their fat-free mass. And that gives us a better idea of general body composition and overall health there. The last thing I will say is there is a certain amount of essential fat that you will need just for function, for your body to properly work. In men, that is around 3%, whereas in women, it's about 12%. So a little bit higher there. I'm going to skip through the micronutrients because I have a feeling everyone wants just to get to the foam rolling stuff. For women, I will very much point towards looking at the vitamin A, D, K, as well as calcium and phosphorus information included in here just for bone health, because I see a lot of 60 and 70-year-olds who come in with femoral fractures. One of the best things you can do is just keep your bones as strong as you can with what you guys are likely already doing in here, with a little bit of exercise, resistance training, and then on top of that, some of the stuff in terms of the dietary recommendations and getting those specific micronutrients to make sure that those bones are as strong as they can be. So no fractures. You don't have to see me for that kind of stuff in the future. Water, I'll just briefly touch on this. Men, 3.7 liters, it's about 125 ounces. Women, 2.7 liters, 91 ounces. Couple of quick indicators if you're not getting that is you might have a little bit higher resting heart rate. So normally heart rate at rest is about 60 to 100 beats per minute. At rest, if you're getting higher than that, that can be a sign that you are dehydrated. Second quick thing you could notice is that urine, a little bit yellow, a little bit more odoriferous. That's just a quick metric. Get some more water. Also, DOMS can be attenuated, exacerbated by lack of hydration. So getting proper water intake will actually make you feel less sore. The last thing I will talk about that is not related to foam rolling is sleep. There is a myriad of deleterious health effects, increased dementia, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, so on and so forth, that are correlated with poor sleep. So a couple quick things is complete darkness. What happens when you sleep is there's a small tiny gland right behind your neck. It's called your pineal gland. That secretes melatonin. So I'm sure everyone's heard melatonin or potentially taken it before. Darkness is what stimulates that. That is what helps you get to sleep. So potentially if you're looking at screens before you go to sleep, that's something that will not allow you to get there. I would recommend at least an hour before you go to bed, take any kind of white light screen, take it away. Or if you are gonna look at screens, see if there's a setting on your computer or laptop that will allow you to change that into a dark mode. Second thing is blue light exposure in the morning. So it's sort of hard for us, given that we live in Washington, the state of eternal cloudiness. In the morning, you want to try and get as much white light as you can. The reason that is there is a neurotransmitter called adenosine that slowly builds throughout the day. It's like one of those buckets at the water park where as soon as it fully fills, it turns over. That turning over would equate to us going to sleep. So the idea is we don't want to tip that bucket too early, and that becomes important in napping. If we take naps too late in the day, that neurotransmitter essentially gets dampened and it just gets much harder for us to fall asleep and stay asleep. The third thing is cool environments. Our body actually cools about 1 degree when we go to sleep. So if we're super duper warm, if we're just stacked with a ton of blankets, it might feel a little bit harder. There's a couple other things that can play into that. The thermic effect of food. It's a fancy way of saying when I eat a big old meal, my body will burn that, just like a running engine in a car, how it gets a little warm. That's what will happen, and that can increase our body temperature if we take a very large meal right before we go to bed. So in lieu of that, try and get your last meal about 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed. It should eliminate that from becoming a factor. And then the last thing I'll say about cool environments, a cool trick is actually to use a sauna or a very warm shower before you go to sleep. Weirdly enough, if you get your skin very, very warm, your core temperature will actually have to cool down to make sure that your core temperature just doesn't get too darn warm. So it's a quick trick to help you get to sleep a little bit better. And then just generally speaking, 7 to 9 hours, that's sort of the consensus on regular sleeping amount.